Thanks so much for joining us for a chat today about Antónia Szabari's new book, which will not come into focus, but it's here. Agents Without Empire, Mobility and Race-Making in 16th Century France, out from Fordham University Press this year. The program today is organized in partnership with the Department of French and Italian and the Department of Comparative Literature at USC. We do invite everyone who is able to turn on their camera to please do so. It is much nicer for the author and for everyone else to see faces rather than just names or still photos. Yay, thank you all so much. All the cameras. Joining us today to talk about Antonia's book are Ayesha Ramachandran, who is Professor of Comparative Literature at Yale University, and Alani Hicks-Bartlett, who is Assistant Professor of Comparative Literature, French and Francophone Studies, and Hispanic Studies at Brown University. And the conversation will be moderated by our colleague at USC, Edwin Hill, Associate Professor of French and Italian and American Studies and Ethnicity. Our program is very simple. Antónia will first introduce her book, giving brief comments, and then we will move on to a conversation between Antónia, Alani, and Ayesha, and we will have roughly the last 15 minutes for questions from everyone. Edwin will let us know when we start with the questions, and we ask that you please use your Zoom hand and to get in the queue if you have a question, and not use the chat for questions, as that gets distracting. So many congratulations on your book, Antónia, and please tell us about it. You will need to unmute for that.
Thank you, Daniela. Thank you for this opportunity, for this wonderful gathering of colleagues and friends, and also some unknown faces. And thanks also to the moderator, Edwin Hill, and Ayesha and Alani for attending this. And I look forward to your questions, and I look forward to the conversation. So I'm going to start with a personal anecdote about this book, because this book took a little while to write. I think we academics say this a lot. I started out on this book project, which I thought was about French diplomacy in the Ottoman Empire in the 16th century. And that was supposed to be not just the first European state to have a diplomatic relations, but also, for me, a kind of emblematic or enigmatic event in French culture. And I had a friend at the time, an anthropologist, who said, just go all in. This is your second project. This is the time to take risks. And so I started learning Turkish, and I went to Istanbul for years in the summers. I started learning Arabic. And I got myself a handbook of Ottoman, because I was really bothered about just looking at the French side. And I realized after a few years of doing this that I really could not have the philological skills to read Ottoman, that I was shut out of that. But I find myself at ARIT, which is the American Research Institute in Istanbul, one winter, working in their library, reading everything I could. And after a reception, after a talk, or during a reception after a talk, I found myself talking with colleagues. And it turns out that all of us were from different countries. I grew up in Hungary, and one person was from Bulgaria, another from Tunisia, and so on and so on. And we realized that we were all coming from countries that were once part of the Ottoman Empire. And at that point, I realized that was probably as close as I'm going to get, this sort of shadow of the empire to the Ottoman Empire. And also realized that, I know about my own national narratives about being conquered, and how it's played up and down and all sorts of things. And I realized that the French also come from an angle that is similarly embedded in a national narrative, but that is also very different from mine. That at the time in the 16th century, they were looking in on that area, the Ottoman Empire and its borderlands, from a very specific perspective, and that perspective has to do with kind of admiring the empire, emulating it. Of course, in real political terms, they were also using it against Spain and its imperial power, and that they that narrative is going to be what frames looking at this culture of diplomacy. And that also made it clear to me that I had to look at that is sort of apolitical angle onto all the cultural productions around this this event, including, of course, the diplomatic correspondence, which, thanks to Tim Hampton's book, we have sort of learned to think about also as part of literary culture. And also all the books that are usually treated as travel books, all the poetry, all the art, and so on and so on. And later I got into also fashion and other things that cannot be looked at from an apolitical angle. And that also that those authors are also really agents, and very often in practical terms, information gatherers and spies. And that there is a kind of blending of the two cultures. So this was one aspect that provided a very strong frame for me, and that is somewhat personal. And then the other is, of course, the question of race. I realized that generally in French studies, this era and encounters of the other, right, is usually how it's being discussed in the Ottoman Empire or outside of Europe, and in the so-called New World in the Americas, is usually thought of as as opportunities and moments of opening, right? Epistemologically, in terms of understanding of the self, as cultural flexibility. And I do think that these world makers are pretty flexible, and they're world makers. I'm using Ayesha's word here, but I thought that to analyze their representations from an apolitical stance would have been completely disingenuous. That the symbolic and imaginative shaping of the world that they saw, and I want to say that the Ottoman Empire was like a miniature version of the world to them. It was so diverse and so vast that they almost, I think, used it as a metaphor for the world. I also realized that, and this is not just me, it's well known that literature about the Ottoman Empire in the 16th century is much more abundant in France than literature about the so-called New World, about the Americas. And so their symbolic and imaginative fashioning of this world really falls along lines, including thinking in terms of material nature rather than institutions and culture and history. Thinking in terms of physiognomy, degrees of freedom, speed, mobility or the lack of mobility, focusing in on animal bodies, and degrees of beauty and perfection, boundaries between the animal and the human, that these all fall along lines that that could be considered racializing or race terms. And in parentheses, I would like to say that in French studies of the period, race is not a term that is often discussed. Race in terms of racism or ontological differentiation, immoral discrimination, that does not exist. There's a very interesting term, race, that also exists in Italian and Spanish, razza, that usually French scholars consider as purely social and not racializing. And so I set out to map this. And I think what I do in the book is a kind of experiential working through of these texts and of these figures, of these metaphors, of of creating this world that they're fascinated with, that they're afraid of, that they're moving around in, by using, and I'm lucky here because there's I think a critical mass of scholars working on early modern race and race terms. And so I do a kind of experiential working out of these terms. I don't think there is one term for race. And I think this is where also we can argue a lot, like have maybe productive discussions about what distinctions exist. But for me, it was very important to work this out precisely because of the lack of this kind of terminology in 16th, even for a larger part, 17th century French studies. And yeah, okay. And I just wanted one last thing. I think I rely a lot on close reading because I wanted to, and which can be a little slow going, I know, but I wanted to really provide a lot of examples and a kind of texture to this argument. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I'll just jump right in, I guess. But first, thank you, Antonio, for this invitation and to everyone who's made this discussion possible. And I just wanted to take one moment to just sincerely congratulate you on another really wonderful book. I'm really happy to have this chance to discuss with you and Ayesha and others today. And your book is just really rich and generative. And I think one of its many affordances is it sparks so many questions while getting right to the core of these issues that are really crucial to the fields of pre-modern race-making, literary studies, materiality, and visual culture, political and diplomacy studies, and not to mention the many theories of political and authorial agency that you bring into the discussion that have needed kind of a critical revision and reorientation for so long. And so you do such a really magisterial job of weaving these different strands together from such like transhistorical kind of origins and multi-generic sources and texts. So I just wanted to celebrate this really wonderful achievement and the fact that this book now exists in the world. But in particular, I think Agents of Empire makes a lot of hugely important reassessments and critical interventions about these dynamic moments related to race making and the self that are occurring and in motion, like you say, long before the rise of the French colonial empire. So I thought my first question is kind of like, I wanted to both signal that even in your appreciation of the philosophies and theorizations of orientation, and of course, throughout your book, you engage in depth with Sarah Ahmed's wonderful work on desire and sociopolitical agency and phenomenological orientation. And I think even the focus that you're giving thematically or topically and methodologically to reorientation is really helpful in reprioritizing and opening up these like canonical texts or longstanding canonical issues like agency that then help us have a better understanding of how race and race making play and have and are accorded a kind of determinative role in knowledge production and cultural exchange. And so I have some broader questions that I hope we might be able to get to later. But on this issue of kind of canonical reorientations and political identity, engagement, and agency, I was thinking to start with something that's maybe a bit more specific, but feel free to take it in whatever direction you prefer. So one of the elements I really appreciated and learned from in your chapter on Montaigne was how you discuss his negotiation of distance and masculinity and what you call mixed agency. And this attention that you're continually drawing to, I don't know if I should call it the centering or maybe the suffusion of the political across his essays, and to the insistence upon custom and the weight of tradition, and how he embraces these like fictions of agency. So I was just hoping that I could hear you speak a bit more about how Montaigne tests the body and how the various authors and agents you're bringing into the discussion test the body in order to use that experimentational space to forge this internal freedom on the path to their construction of these universal selves that are nonetheless still negotiating moderation and tradition and these institutional strictures that could otherwise be very limiting or can be very limiting. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. So about testing, thank you, Alani. I mean, there's Alison Calhoun wrote an article about Montaigne and his kidney stones. I mean, Montaigne. Everybody probably knows a little bit about Montaigne, that he had a complicated identity because he was nobleman, but not really. I mean, he was really officially nobleman, but not of a long pedigree, and we really don't know that much about his life either, but Alison Calhoun wrote this essay, which I discovered in the process of thinking about this whole notion of testing, about how he thinks about his pain associated with his kidney stones as ennobling, in the same sense as kind of there used to be military prowess that constituted the knight's nobility, right? And it's both the pain and also the management of pain. So it's not just suffering; it's also going to baths. And Montaigne is, of course, very important. I think he's really important, and that's what I consider maybe the most, like the hardest knot of this book is the cannibal, right? And the way in which he sets up this testing. I was already thinking about it because I was thinking about nudity, and he has an essay in which he says we really don't need to wear clothes because, and that's a very cynical, I mean, in a classical sense, a cynic argument. But of course he wears clothes, but because the natural body is capable of withstanding all the onslaught of that comes from the environment, and that argument I think is very rich, and I think it's very much a huge extent. It gives a huge extension to Alison Calhoun's argument, beyond the kind of social cultural terms, because and I think it obviously is very much linked to the notion of the cannibal, this idea that you look for a natural body type that would be somehow excellent or not, that is testable under in a world, again, I'm thinking of Ayesha's world making in a modern world, right? A world that is unstable, that is in flux, that is political in this sense, that is also material. And this testing would create some sort of certainty, some sort of selfhood, and also that would be distinguished from others. I mean, Montaigne is quite outspoken about this. He says that there's sometimes a lot more difference between certain people than there is between people and animals, which and of course, if we want to be kind of thinking in intellectual historical terms, I think this notion of testing is goes along with the idea of the perfectibility of nature and of the natural body. And just want to say, I only became aware of Mackenzie Cooley's book on the perfection of nature, because it was published when after I finished the manuscript, after I finished correcting the manuscript. But that's the idea, right? It's the notion of raza, and so that's very important. But the other aspect of it is, and of course that's there's a growing consensus, I think, among early modern scholars that that's race thinking. But then there's also the question of the cannibal, right? There's the question of this understanding the self through others, through these singularities out in the world. that tend to be very cherry-picked. And I don't write much about the cannibal, but I do say that there is this type of itinerant naked man appears in the Ottoman Empire before it even appears in the New World. And that's, of course, the Delhi here. Yeah, I'm just going to stop there. I'm a little bit troubled because I think my book really critiques the noble savage idea also. And I'm not always critical of the noble savage, but I'm developing an argument that makes me very skeptical about most of its iterations, I think, yeah.
Maybe I'll jump in there, Antónia, and just to echo Alani, and what a provocative book this is in so many ways, and in part because I think it allows itself to explore what seem to be sort of old shibboleths in the field around selfhood, around agency, around race, around who is a subject and who isn't, and it sort of puts pressure on all of these terms by really asking us to think about both their shifting ambivalent fluidities in this period, but also by, I think, and this is what I think is so extraordinary about it, you allow yourself to think through these ideas systematically and slowly to their sometimes disturbing conclusions, or sometimes not entirely conclusive conclusions, which is what I actually really appreciated about this book. But maybe to kind of go right to the heart of the animal-human question, which I think, surfaces in so many interesting ways across this book, and that you just alluded to with Montaigne. I mean, we remember, of course, that the opening address to the reader in the essay also imagined himself naked, and that there's the question of a rhetorical nakedness versus a natural nakedness, and that line between language and the body, between what you call, forms of speaking or rhetoric, and the kind of materiality or physicality, which you use a range of different terms for. And I wonder if this is a good moment actually to unpack sort of two big axes of the book. One is the question of agency itself. And, I think one of the things you do very usefully here is to allow the slipperiness of these terms to be slippery in the 16th century. And by that, I mean agent as an actor, somebody who is in control of his own actions versus the agent of a monarch, thinking about agency here as a subordination of somebody else's will versus the kind of agency of asserting one's own will, and thinking about the way in which these terms sort of slide in and out of each other. But similarly, terms like animality and animacy. What does it mean for matter itself to be animate, for the body itself or nature itself to be responsive? And I'm wondering if you can just unpack for us how you think you are reorienting in this book the ways in which I think we've taken for granted, in a sense, the story about the rise of the individual, about the agentive, autonomous self on the one hand, and on the other hand, the animal-human line, which certainly in a lot of recent Black studies, and you cite figures like Zakiya Iman-Jackson, have kind of asked us to think about less as some kind of definitive post-Cartesian division, but more as, again, a kind of sliding scale that we are once again interested in. So just inviting you to kind of unpack two of those big kind of conceptual frameworks.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. It's a very difficult question because, as you say, I think sometimes I just try to not come down on the side of one or the other. And that's the question. I am fascinated by these authors. I think the book grew out of a fascination of the accounts they give. And yet at the same time, I'm also very disturbed, and it coalesced into a ideologically sometimes very, I say, parochial or rigid system, right? Out of which they also, in some ways, try to escape, at least some of them. So where do I come down? I think, I mean, you put it best. I think it is a sliding scale, and I do think that maybe some of the things that I I struggled with is, where do I stop at looking at the various layers of the onion here, right? How far do I want to peel back the different layers? I feel like most of the time I stopped where it seemed like, again, the question of language, right? Where it seemed like there was a sufficient amount of argument made, and there was a picture that was emerging. But I feel that well, I also feel like I came down more on the side of racism than of openness. But I don't know. I say something in the beginning of the book that I've thought a lot about, which is that that something like, I don't really want to cancel these authors, but we need to know this in order to read them, right? And I try to mean that. I think I hope that there is more to be said here, and that these scales can be slid back and forth, which is not to relativize it, but more that that they're still worth reading for us. I don't know if I answered your question, but that's kind of what comes to my mind, and that was going through my mind here. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Sorry, my internet dropped in the middle of that, but I caught most of it. So yes, I think that that's certainly the beginning of what I think is hopefully a richer conversation that your book will stimulate. But I'm gonna maybe step back for a moment and let Alani pick up from there, and we can go back and forth perhaps.
Sure. That sounds great. And yeah, thank you. I just really appreciated hearing that question and answer also. But on a kind of related note, I think the attention that you give throughout your book to vulnerability really foregrounds, I think, one of the corners maybe of this issue of subjectivity and agency. And I really loved how Ayesha in her question to you termed the slipperiness as a kind of sliding scale, because I think in many of the examples and anecdotes that you bring to the fore, we see how, upon entering a place, there's one type of agential kind of orientation, and then it changes drastically to even flip on the other side. But more specifically, you invite us to really contemplate the body and its wholeness, or its various parts, or the body and its nakedness, going back to au lecteur, or the numerous kind of sartorial envelopes that the body can trade or traffic or borrow, or I guess in some cases repudiate. Then I think a lot of the authors and agents that you're dealing with are really giving attention to the growth and movement. I mean, we have a very literal example that you bring to the fore in your chapter on Rabelais, and in the introduction, I think, as well, in the discussion of giants and idealized or denigrated corporeal proportionality. And I was wondering, especially about medicine, plants, drugs, and those kinds of things, when you give this attention to the vulnerability again of skin and its porosity, in contrast to how it can sometimes be considered more of a protective shield. And then finally, kind of just recapping some of these major threads that I think really engage with some pressing questions in the field of disability studies and subjectival orientations. We have a really sustained consideration in many of the authors and agents you're dealing with of Aristotelian and Galenic assessments of the body and humoral theory, or alchemy and climate theory, etc. But so in one moment of your book in particular, in the Birdman 2 chapter, you discuss the rash and kind of the itchy after effects that touching this poisonous plant. And it becomes something that ultimately proves to be a community building experience. I think in this case in particular, it's a kind of ludic aperture, and that laughter and kind of builds the community. But this really signaled to me one thread that runs throughout the book, which is the attention you give to community through these practices of care and care work. We see it also in the anecdote about the woman. I think this also goes back to Montaigne, but in the anecdote about the woman who's carrying the baby calf, who grows over time and becomes weightier and weightier. So the process of care has to turn kind of around the calf's growing body. So I just wanted to invite you to maybe discuss a bit more, if you would, how the attention to illness and bodily fluid in many of the texts of your authors ultimately, contributes to a better understanding of this sometimes tenuous back and forth between the individual and the community that we see negotiated often through care work, or the rejection of care work and care. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so I mean, these people, I think you guys are both sort of calling me to talk about one aspect, which is maybe, which I thought a lot about. Is it too much to add? But I do think that the argument works better, at least for me, by calling attention to the fact that these agents, they are under really contingent circumstances, and they are vulnerable. They're incredibly vulnerable. I mean, this is something that I became aware of by reading a lot of diplomatic correspondence, a lot of it. I somehow like these projects when I don't just read canonical works, but I read stuff that people don't read. Maybe I'm drawn to these archives of, in this case, to diplomatic correspondence, and you read all the time that so-and-so died in an accident because a ship went down, or so-and-so died from the plague. There's a lot of risk there was a lot of risk in this line of work, and there were also mostly people who had very little support from their own employers, so to speak. I mean, we are in the servant system here, and I think they're in somewhat of denial of their vulnerability, but they're struggling with it the whole time. Montaigne, I think, is especially insightful about it, and that's why I am analyzing the calf anecdote when I think he meditates on this situation of a young peasant woman holding a calf, and then caressing this calf and holding it as it grows into I think a bull, and it becomes a crushing weight. I think this is part of the picture of empire building, and I think as for the care, I'm struggling with a little bit with what care. Maybe you can help me a little bit, Alani, here. What care would constitute in this respect? I didn't particularly zoom in on the interpersonal aspect of it. I don't know if I use the term care in the book. I do use vulnerability and various degrees of being aware of it, and also various degrees of denial, right? So, for example, that Pierre Bellon doesn't even talk about him being captured by pirates, and piracy was rampant in the Mediterranean region from all sides. That he only talks about it in kind of from a distance perspective. I'm not sure. I'm not sure what care means in this context. I don't know if I can throw back the question to you.
Yeah, maybe just briefly, I'll say that actually care does come up quite a bit. So I was just really enthralled with how you were using it. But I think I think your question back to me also points to the wonderful affordance of looking at care and care work, because we see it even in terms of measurement, bodily measurement, and you give so much attention also to observation. So and maybe that's in a more medicalized context sometimes, but what does medicalized care look like even? And I think I'm trying to think more capaciously than just the Montaigne chapter, which I really love. I love the whole book, but I think also throughout the book you are talking about the natural needs of the body. So even something like that is, I think, really foregrounding like the exigencies of care. And I think, though, in the Montaigne chapter in particular, he's really tying what I think, per my understanding of your chapter, he's really tying kind of a person's excellence and this ennobling process that you're talking about to the care that somebody takes of their body. And I think that goes back, and I'll toss it to Ayesha in a second, but I think that goes back also to kind of the comment, Ayesha, that you were making about, again, Olecter, where the positionality of the body, or even how much of the body we're seeing, or this rejection, the refusal to show us the body, completely and completely naked, how that can speak to a certain type of care too, but also with even in the choice of a signature that involves a turban that one wouldn't normally be able to wear. I think there's a stylized sense of care that can also kind of amplify that question too, that ties a lot into the sartorial and political and other things as well.
Yeah, can I maybe just jump in? I did put quite a bit of thought into how Rabelais in particular, because I always start with Rabelais for some reason, because Rabelais kind of sidesteps the hierarchy of the political hierarchy of the monarchy, right? And I think maybe that's where care comes in, that food is the one that is the thing that manages health and health of the community, health of the nation in this proto-national sense. Obviously then it becomes also a question of making distinctions, but yeah, I do think that I see your point now, that you can think through this as care. What you say about the care for the body, of course, it's a double-edged sword, because what I see is that these fashions that have to do with, yes, the care of the body, the ronsard, beard, and they become, I think, distinctive marks of a certain kind of self, right? Which I try to say is the French masculine self, that's also coded as Christian and coded as more and more as white, I think, at least in some cases. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
We have time for one last question from Ayesha, and then we'll open it up to the audience.
Sounds great. Thinking about care, which I think in some ways is invited by the question of vulnerability, I want to ask a little bit about two things, I guess. One is selfhood, and I think there is an interesting tension in this book between your beginning with the Aristotelian notion of virtuous action, which leads, as you point out, to this sort of formulation of a kind of rational autonomous self, the rise of the individual, that narrative. And then the sort of phenomenological experience of these actors whom you trace over and over again, which looks at something more like what Charles Taylor, has called a permeable self. The idea that the 16th century is perhaps a period in which we don't yet have that bounded rational enlightenment self, but what we do have is a kind of a greater openness that is perhaps more medieval. I'm thinking here of Barbara Newman's recent book on the permeable self. And that is open both to the environment, but to other communities and other ways of being. And there's a power in that, as well as an ambivalence. And it's not a framework that you use. And I think recently there's been a lot of interest in comparative anthropology and sort of thinking about this notion of kind of revisiting old ideas of the kind of so-called European self, the Western self, to kind of think about these ways in which the self might be less the self, but a kind of work in progress, a kind of notion of a thing that is ontologically perhaps more open, more multiple, and less bounded than we have been wont to think in thinking about the early modern. And that leads me to what I think is another important underlying thread of this book that I hope your readers pick up on, which is, you are interested in the kind of ongoing effects of the 16th century moment into our own contemporary world. And there are many trans-historical gestures in this book. I love the moment when Billon connects with Deleuze and Hitchcock. So, you know, I think there are lots of these moments. I was teaching Césaire actually just yesterday in class, and, you know, thinking about your book at the same time, and the incredible resonance between how we think about selves and bodies, you know, in the 20th century, in the 21st century, but also the ways in which these figures are navigating or thinking about it in the 16th. So maybe you can comment on that.
Thank you. I completely agree with you, Ayesha. And I should have, it's another concept and another book I should have referenced. I loved following these people and kind of figuring out as they drifted through this space and try to maintain a self, right? A self that was acceptable to them, which I think I outline in the book, but at the same time, always by kind of absorbing, for example, Postel, wandering in Anatolia, right? Absorbing elements of other cultures, other selves, right? That they were using to fabricate this self. So yes, absolutely. I mean, also the question of the bath and the porousness of the body, up to which point is it acceptable? But yes, I think it's absolutely constructive, and I think that's a great way of putting it. Yes, I agree with that. Mm-hmm. And it's a good way of showing how there is a kind of construction going on here that, yeah, maybe we need to return to the early modern self to understand more about. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Oh, we're right on time. It's just time for opening it up for questions. So if you want to ask a question, please raise your hand using the Zoom function under React. And as you think about your questions, I'll ask my own, as is custom. And there's so many different things in this book that we haven't even had a chance to talk about really so far. I was really drawn to your discussion of fashion, but also your discussion of ceremonies.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, the theatrical and choreographic elements that you talk about in the book. So I was wondering if you could say a few words about how gesture, not just mobility, but gesture, dance,
Mm-hmm.
and other kinds of, you know, sort of performances,
Mm-hmm.
bodily performances, as you talk about them, come into play in this book.
Yeah, I think performance and performativity is very important. I don't really stray into theater studies, but I think it connects with a few axes of analysis and argument. One is that these people were kind of rebelling against, I mean, Rabelais outspokenly so, against a new kind of administrative order that was legalistic. And performance also allowed for making, I think it was more broadly used in the diplomatic practice between the French and the Ottomans, because it allowed for a certain kind of choreography. I imagine it was, according to the accounts, it was embraced by both sides. The ceremonial side of diplomacy is already a given. It was otherwise hard for people to communicate or to feel that they're coming together. So I was wondering about maybe there was all too much optimism about that at some point in French diplomacy. And yes, then the question of fashion. I think that that actually that fashion, those fashion gestures, and from the 16th century, kind of linger on in French fashion. I have that suspicion, but I didn't really. I think Daisy's here, and Daisy read the manuscript, and there was a moment when I said something about that in the coda, and Daisy, you said like, I don't see the I don't see the connection here, and because it was just abruptly put there, but I was thinking about it and I could not articulate it in a. And that was the right call to make for the editor, and I took it out. But I have this suspicion that performing that care of the body and that self performance has stayed on in French culture.
For sure. Daniela.
Thank you. I also wanted to ask you about something that we haven't had a chance to talk about yet, which is mobility and your how you're conceiving of that, because there's so much movement of different kinds in the book, right? So there's human bodies and also objects going from place to place and sort of being changed by that movement. But there's also a lot of movement that is encountered on the page of a manuscript, on the page of a book. So that is not, it's a different kind of movement. And so I wanted to hear how you're thinking about the relationship between the two, about sort of movement, you know, in space, like embodied versus movement on the page.
You mean the fact that there were all these books written about these experiences?
Well, there's books written, there's many images drawn and then
Yeah.
images engraved and printed. So, you know, your wonderful use of visual material, almost all of it comes from, you know, pages or from prints and manuscripts. So I wanted to hear about, you know, the people who are traveling on the page, which is on the ground.
So I think movement is a big given. Mobility wasn't originally in the title, but it became convenient and advised. I was advised to put it in, and I like it. And precisely because, as Ayesha's book says too, the modern world is about movement, and it's about mobility, and not just mobility in terms of travel, but it's also in terms of the mobility of the world around us, right? That things move and things change, and that there is a new kind of understanding and appreciation of that. So in terms of the visual images, which I think your most your question focuses on, that's a tricky question. I feel like I'm dabbling in visual culture here, but I think they play a huge role in training people to think about bodies and to think about movement. I think they have this power to extend mobility in some ways. I'm not sure exactly in what way. I think again, more could be said about that, but they have this kind of strong media power to them that they can extend mobility to the viewers in some ways. They can move their eyes over the images. Certainly something I enjoy doing, and make their own experiences. And in some cases, I talk about how they train the eyes of the viewers to see things in a certain way, but I do think that there is mobility there too somewhere. It's the best I can say right now.
No, I think one of the, if there's not any other questions from the audience, I'll just keep going. I think that one of the major things that struck me in reading the book was this intervention that you make essentially in race studies, where you say, you know, maybe race isn't quite the product of modernity like we think it is, you know, and that really kind of, I was like, wait, but you're going against everything I'm reading. And so I'm sort of still thinking about like what that means for the post-colonial scholar paying attention to this proto-colonial moment that you're thinking about, you know, and finding these traces and these seeds that of kind of like racial thought or kind of a play with racial thought that precedes the modern era, like kind of what the stakes that, you know, what kind of stakes that holds for a scholar like me who's kind of thought about race essentially from as kind of like you know, kind of like the essence of the arrival of modernity in some ways, or the modern. So I'm wondering, you know, if you could speak more about that intervention, and you know, also, you know, the gestures you make throughout to, you know, the new world and to, you know, Blackness.
Yeah, that's a big question. Yes. And I feel, okay, so that's a lot of questions. First of all, it's not just my intervention. There are, outside of French studies, there are scholars who have started working on concepts of race. I mentioned a few, and they don't have exactly the same notion of race. Starting with Geraldine Hanks, that is a kind of maybe the most general, and she's a medievalist, and it's also the most global. Cord Whittaker is focused on Blackness in the Middle Ages, and in some ways, I think the muteness of the shimmering, the muteness of Black bodies, and the way in which they become metaphors for something that is incredibly intense, but also kind of shuts down signification. I think his work is actually kind of following what Toni Morrison does on Blackness in her lecture. I forgot which lecture that is, but I cite it in the book. And I also want to say on Blackness is that I feel like that gets the shortest shrift in this book, in part because there were the fewest examples that I found. But for me, I think I could maybe I should have thought more about that final description of the slave market in Cairo. So that's one. The other thread is, I think, situatedness. So I think early modern scholars have, I think, this instinctual attention to situatedness, because the people we write about are in a different era, in a different place, and in a very different situation from us. And so I think it's not surprising to many of us that there are concepts of race. In fact, what you find out is that you simply are confronted with an understanding of race, or different understandings of race, in the materials that you look at. I think Ian Smith, who is a colleague of mine in English, talks about this quite a bit, that they could read race in a way we cannot read race. For him, it's in Shakespeare, and in especially. But I think so some of it is just to is kind of to dig up those understandings, and then, of course, yes, the other is, I think, to have conversations with what we understand today as race, because I don't think that they're unrelated. I mean, yeah. So that's a lot. I don't know if it responds completely to your questions, but that's how I kind of
It's an ongoing
go out
discussion.
a
Yeah.
task for myself. Yeah.
Yeah, Ayesha.
I see Daisy has a hand up, and maybe I'll give her the last word. So we have another one.
Are you sure? Is that okay? Thank you very much. First of all, Antónia, huge congratulations. It's amazing to see this book published. I have probably quite a short question for you. I noticed that your introduction starts out with this description of these like ballooning vegetal kind of growths in Rabelais. And I, of course, extremely admired your previous book, Radical Botany. I'm sure that many other people here did. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about what it was like moving from dealing with the vegetal in speculative fiction in your first book to now dealing with it in this kind of 16th century early modern perspective. Is there anything maybe that surprised you? Is there anything that this new project gave you a new lens through which to see your previous work, or vice versa?
Yeah, so I mean, back to Daniela's question, I try to be mobile. I don't but also, of course, I do draw on my earlier work. So here, I think one link was the question of matter and old, and as my colleague Natanya Meeker likes to put, the difference between old materialisms and new materialisms. And old materialisms are different, but there are plenty of connections as well. So I think that's another intellectual connection there that is fascinating to me. And yeah, the story about the meddlers and eating them, I mean, that's all about in a way care, as now I came to think about it that way. And a politics of eating and contingency, but it's also about race in the in the way in which they used this metaphor, raza, in Romance languages in the late 15th and 16th, 17th century, which is to say the qualities of the bodies, right, that come out of it. And I think that was just such a vivid description of mobility from vegetal to human bodies, the sap, but also kind of organizing the world and shaping it in a way that I want to call attention to in this book. And of course, also writing in the Ottoman Empire and parts of the Middle East into that narrative in new ways. So yeah, I mean, I was delighted every time that plants came up. I think that's part of this material world and that they encounter. But I think also in Radical Botany, we focused on the utopian and speculative possibilities, whereas I think here I'm a little bit more focused, I think, in spite of all the care and vulnerability, on the closing in of these worlds. Yeah. And
so we are unfortunately at time. Speaking of closing of this world, I'm so sorry.
Sounds good.
So
Thank you.
many congratulations, Antónia, on this book. I hope that the people here who have not read it yet got at least a sense of how rich it is. Thank you so much to Alani Hicks-Bartlett and Ayesha Ramachandran for joining us. Thank you to Edwin Hill for moderating. Thank you all for joining us. And above all, thank you, Antónia, for the book.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.